I find it very difficult to rise to this challenge. I always like to generalize and draw on our history to deal with the present.
Altheia Jones Lecointe was born Altheia Jones in Port of Spain, Trinidad on the 9th of January 1945. Altheia and her sisters Jennifer and Beverly were born to Dustin Jones, a principal of a government school, and Viola Jones, who was a dressmaker and political activist. Viola Jones was a member of the Women's League of the People's National Movement, the Eric Williams founded and led political party that ushered Trinidad through its independence.
The first responsibility that devolves upon you is the protection and promotion of your democracy. Democracy means more, much more, than the right to vote.
From a very young age, Viola took her daughters to marches and political campaigns for causes like child welfare, public health, and women's equality.
Democracy means recognition of the rights of others. Democracy means the equality of all in the eyes of the law. Democracy means responsibility of the government to its citizens, the protection of the citizens from the exercise of arbitrary power and the violation of human freedom and individual rights. Democracy means freedom of expression and assembly and organization. All that is democracy. All that is our democracy.
And in the last 500 years, African people in the Caribbean have been wandering around the world.
It's to no surprise then that when Altheia came to the UK at age 19, after being accepted into University College London's PhD biochemistry program, she continued this political tradition.
And after the meeting, we went somewhere having something to eat till 4 in the morning.
Altheia first began organising around issues like student racism in housing. Many black students who were travelling to the UK were being turned away by racist landlords. She would also attend meetings and study groups at the house of activists and scholars Selma and CLR James, who would become her friends and mentors.
What we want to do now is to give you some idea of how much you can win.
As the campaign around student housing issues intensified, Altheia was introduced to the Black Panther Movement, which had been founded by Obi Egbuna in 1968. The Panthers showed solidarity to the students in their fight against racist landlords, even attending one of the students' demonstrations in which Altheia met her future husband, Eddie Lecointe.
And that's when I met Eddie, and 40 years later, we're still battling it out. And we were part of the Black Panther movement.
In recent years, there's been many references to Altheia as the leader of the Black British Panthers. But as she has often stated, the Panthers believed in a collective leadership approach to political struggle. This meant that no one person was above the collective.
I don't know how suddenly I've become a leader. We didn't recognize those categories. Yes, that's what you say, but we didn't recognize those categories. We believed in collective leadership.
Nonetheless, Altheia's tenure in the Black Panther movement coincided with an incredible amount of grassroots political activity from the group. This included cataloguing nearly 150 incidents of police violence and harassment in the community newspaper, as well as holding 77 cultural events across the country, including cities like Bradford, Bristol, Birmingham, Derby, Manchester, Leeds, Nottingham, and of course, their home of London. Altheia will go on to recruit many black teenagers into the Panther movement via their youth league. One notable recruitment was poet Linton Kwesi Johnson. Although she denies being the leader of the Black Panther movement, Altheia's contribution was noticed by many. Jessica Huntley, the founder of the Bogle Louverture Publications and Bookshop, described Altheia as being one of the most powerful black women in the country during the mid-60s to early 70s. Back home, the economic instability and rising unemployment of the recently independent Trinidad caused Altheia's mother Viola to have to migrate to New York in search of better employment opportunities. Meanwhile, like their mother and sister before them, Jennifer and Beverly would become even more involved in revolutionary politics. With their mother in New York, Beverly and Jennifer would attend late-night meetings of the National Joint Action Committee, or NJAC. NJAC would become the driving force behind the 1970 Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and Tobago. NJAC started out as a student movement, but quickly reached out to the unemployed and the radicals in the union movement, including the Oil Field Workers Trade Union. The growing Black Power movement in Trinidad was being dismissed by the Williams government, who saw it as inconsequential. Meanwhile, the youth of Trinidad and the working classes' dissatisfaction with the lack of meaningful change since independence was boiling over. This sentiment was also felt by Trinidadians around the world, like Williams' former teacher C.L.R. James, and of course, by Altheia. In solidarity with her sisters, the national bus boycott, and the workers' union in Trinidad, Altheia led a protest against Trinidadian Prime Minister Eric Williams during a meeting chaired by Ansel Wong at the West Indian Student Center. The rumor is, instead of discussing the concerns of the group who had confronted him, many of whom, like Altheia, would have come from Trinidad, Eric Williams just simply switched off his hearing aid.
And we recognized that in isolating leaders, we became vulnerable to the machinations of the press, the media, and so on and so forth.
So on and so forth. As attacks against the US chapters of the Black Panther Party grew more frequent, the British Black Panther Movement, who were in touch with the US Panthers, were aware that they were also targets for surveillance and potential attacks from the British government. Altheia, in particular, was aware of this from very early on.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to present to you...
On Saturday, February 3rd, 1968, students, fans, and whoever else could cram themselves into the room came down to the West Indian Student Center to watch James Baldwin give a talk. The brilliant speech is covered in Horace Overe's film Baldwin's Nib. If you watch carefully enough, as the camera cuts between Baldwin and the crowd, you'll see a young woman with a folder held in front of her face.
I'll tell you a story, May.
To the others in the room, this may have looked overprecautious or maybe even borderline paranoid, but as early as 1967, following Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Toure's speech at the Roundhouse, the Special Branch's Black Power Desk launched a program similar to COINTELPRO under the order of Roy Jenkins, who was the Home Secretary at the time. Based in New Scotland Yard, the Black Power Desk collected information on the Black Panther movement as they organised over 147 demonstrations against police brutality and institutional racism. One of the Black Power Desk methods of gaining information on the movement was having informants working at local magazines who would take pictures of notable events where black activists would attend.
During slavery, a lot of the people who fought in the Haitian Revolution were deported to other islands in the Caribbean, and my husband Eddie always claims that he's one of them. And in that regard, when I talk about being one of them, I just recognize that we are a continuation of the spirits of those people who fought at that time. So I don't make any distinction between myself and my ancestors.
The very same weekend of one of the British Black Panther movement's most famous demonstrations, known as the March for the Mangrove, 17-year-old Jonathan Jackson, the younger brother of incarcerated Black Panther Party Field Marshal George Jackson, attempted to free his brother and the group known as the Soledad Brothers by taking control of a courtroom with weapons the authorities believed were purchased by Angela Davis. As Jonathan attempted to usher the group to freedom, prison guards opened up fire, and when the bullets stopped, Jonathan Jackson and 3 men, including a judge, were dead. Assata Shakur, still known as Joanne at the time, was in Oakland visiting the Black Panther Party headquarters. In her autobiography, she says she cried tears that she never knew she had when she heard about Jonathan Jackson's killing. Assata attended the funeral of the 17-year-old Jonathan Jackson. She said there were hundreds of people there and they could barely get into the church. Panthers marched in military formation as the funeral began. The funeral had a profound effect on her, and one of the first things she would do upon returning home to New York was join the Black Panther Party, who were going through the New York 21 trial. The same year, Afeni Shakur successfully defended herself in the New York Panther 21 trial while pregnant with her first son, Tupac Amaru Shakur. Altheia, as part of the Mangrove 9, successfully defended herself while pregnant with her daughter, Nandi.
So the stories of a fragmentation, a legion, and it is this struggle actually which makes us whole.
During the Mangrove trial, Selma James would be called as Altheia's key witness. It has been told that Selma and Altheia would often get into arguments because Selma would push Altheia to use her voice more in the movement. Selma believed that Altheia knew exactly what the movement needed more than other prominent voices at the time.
It was my life experience, really. In the struggle, we come to find out who we are and who we are not. Now, in 1973, when Nandi was 1 year old, we decided to go to Trinidad. My parents hadn't seen their grandchild.
In early May 1973, at roughly the same time, Assata Shakur, Zaid Shakur, and Sundiata Rakoli were stopped driving down the New Jersey Turnpike. Beverly Jones was arrested in a suburb of Port of Spain. In the wake of Trinidad's Black Power uprising in 1970, while Altheia was organising with the Panthers in the UK, her sisters Beverly and Jennifer Jones, both similar ages to teenagers Altheia was recruiting to the Panthers, joined NUF.
When we got into Trinidad, we were put in a separate room. We weren't allowed to leave immigration.
NUF, or the National Union of Freedom Fighters, was a group that grew out of NJAC. NUF continued the revolutionary movement that had begun in 1970, beginning with a 4-year armed guerrilla war against the government forces that was inspired by the Cuban Revolution.
We were put in a separate room, and then they started turning over the milk, digging up in the baby clothes. There was a man throwing bullets up in the air, and so we didn't have a clue what this was all about. And when we were finally released because they didn't find the arms and ammunition they were looking for, we came into the situation where my sisters had been fighting against the government.
On the 13th of September 1973, 2 weeks before Beverly's 18th birthday, the quote, flying squad, headed by once police commissioner Randolph Fox Burroughs, who had arrested Beverly back in May, found enough soldiers in Cara Lopino Hills. Beverly Jones, who was pregnant at the time, was shot and killed in a brutal firefight. Her sister Jennifer was captured alive.
The following day, Beverly was brought down dead from the hills. And we were just there in time for her funeral.
Beverly Jones was buried on Monday, the 17th of September 1973. Following the beat of a drum procession, hundreds of mourners, NJAC members and supporters of the revolution carried portraits of Beverly Jones chanting, "Power." 2 weeks after the death of Beverly Jones, Prime Minister Eric Williams announced his retirement from politics.
I just want to say that we have discovered and rediscovered the ways in which we could overcome the fragmentation that is our history. And the way is through joining the struggle, being part of an organized struggle. In some way, find a way to be part of an organized struggle.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
And that is what we have been trying over all our lives to establish in wherever we've lived, to let people be aware that it is an organized struggle that is going to heal that fragmentation that is really such a deep-rooted part of our history. Thank you.
The first responsibility that devolves upon you is the protection and promotion of your democracy.
This episode features music by Tashai Makeda and a speech that Altheia gave at the 2012 Global Women's Strike Panel, where she sat beside Ian MacDonald QC and her longtime friend Selma James, who dedicated her 1973 pamphlet, Race, Sex and Class, to the memory of Beverly Jones.